What if I told you that in the fall of 1943, at the height of the Second World War, the United States Navy didn't just make a warship invisible, they accidentally tore a hole in the fabric of reality itself? What if a top-secret experiment designed to win the war went so horribly wrong that men were fused into the steel deck of their own ship, driven insane, or simply erased from existence? They say it never happened. The official reports deny everything. The witnesses have been discredited. The evidence has been buried under decades of classification stamps and convenient explanations. But the whispers have persisted for 80 years. In Navy bars from Norfolk to San Diego, old sailors still tell stories that make your blood run cold. Stories about ships that bend light around themselves like a stone bends water. About men who walked through walls and screamed about seeing through time. About a destroyer that became a ghost ship flickering between dimensions like a broken television signal. And tonight, we're going to listen to those whispers. We're going to dig into the classified files, the leaked documents, the testimonies that were supposed to stay buried forever. Because sometimes the most boring history is the most terrifying. Alright folks, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you found your comfy spot, maybe dimmed the lights a little, got your favorite blanket within reach. Because tonight we are diving headfirst down one of the deepest, weirdest rabbit holes in military history. We're talking about the Philadelphia experiment. Now, you might have heard bits and pieces of this story before. Maybe you caught that cheesy 1984 movie or stumbled across some late-night documentary that made it sound like science fiction. But forget all that Hollywood nonsense. Forget the sanitized version you might have read on Wikipedia. We're going for the nitty-gritty tonight. The unvarnished truth, or at least the unvarnished legend. We'll look at the so-called shocking evidence, the bizarre characters who claimed they were there. The official denials that only seem to add more fuel to the fire. This is the stuff they definitely don't teach you in school, and there's a very good reason for that. See, the Philadelphia experiment isn't just about whether or not a ship turned invisible. It's about the dangerous intersection of cutting-edge science, military desperation, and the kind of classified research that makes people very, very nervous. It's about what happens when you push the boundaries of physics so hard that reality itself starts to crack. And the most unsettling part, some of the science behind the alleged experiment, well, it's not as impossible as the government would like you to believe. So if you dig this kind of long-form, late-night exploration of history's bizarre underbelly, do me a solid and hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm understand that people want this kind of deep dive content, not just quick sound bites and surface level coverage. And if you haven't already considered subscribing and hitting that notification bell, we do this all the time here. Deep dives into the classified, the covered up, the conveniently forgotten, but only if you're into the real story. The stuff that makes you go, wait, what? And then lie awake thinking about it for 3 hours afterward. No pressure though. I know this isn't everyone's cup of tea. Some people prefer their history neat and tidy with clear heroes and villains and explanations that fit into textbook chapters. But if you're the type who likes to peek behind the curtain, who wants to know what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling and the reporters weren't watching, well, you're in the right place. Okay, seriously now, get comfortable. Let the hum of your refrigerator or the rain outside your window blend with our story. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders relax. We're about to spend the next couple of hours together, so there's no rush. Let the modern world fade away for a bit. Turn off those notifications, close those other tabs. We're heading back to 1943, and it's going to be a journey. A time of desperation, innovation, and secrets. So many secrets. Picture this, it's the height of World War II. The Atlantic is a graveyard of Allied ships torn apart by German U-boats that strike without warning and disappear into the depths. Every merchant vessel, every troop transport, every warship is a sitting duck. The Nazi submarines are winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and everyone knows it. In secret laboratories and classified workshops across America, brilliant minds are working around the clock trying to find some edge, some advantage, some miracle that might turn the tide. Radar is still new and revolutionary. Sonar is primitive. And somewhere in the depths of the Navy's most classified research programs, someone is asking a very dangerous question. What if we could make our ships completely invisible to enemy detection? not just to radar or sonar, invisible to the human eye, invisible to physics itself. Our story doesn't begin with a flash of green light or a disappearing ship. No, it begins much more quietly years after the alleged experiment took place. It starts with a book, a pen, and a series of rambling handwritten letters from a man who claimed he saw it all. A man named Carlos Allende, a merchant mariner who said he watched from the deck of another ship as the USS Eldridge flickered out of existence, traveled through space and time, and returned carrying a cargo of horror that the Navy has been trying to cover up ever since. Was Allende telling the truth? Was he a delusional attention seeker, or was he something more dangerous, a witness who knew too much? That's what we're here to find out. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey into one of the most persistent and disturbing legends in naval history, the Philadelphia experiment, the classified truth they've hidden for 80 years, and the shocking evidence that suggests it might have actually happened. Imagine you're there. Close your eyes and transport yourself back in time. It's October 1943, and you're standing on the pier at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The air is thick with the smell of saltwater welding fumes and that bitter burnt coffee that seems to fuel every military operation. The atmosphere is electric with wartime urgency. There's this constant low-grade anxiety humming beneath the surface of everything. Every sailor, every dock worker, every officer knows that ships are dying out there in the Atlantic. Good men are drowning in the cold, dark water, while U-boats slip away like ghosts. The pressure to find some kind of technological breakthrough, some miracle weapon or defense system is crushing. You can hear the constant din of construction, the rhythmic pounding of hammers on steel, the screech of metal being cut and shaped, the hiss of welding torches. Overhead, seagulls circle and cry, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. The October air carries a chill that cuts through even the thickest Navy peacoat, and there's a smell of approaching winter mixed with diesel fuel and the metallic tang of freshly painted ship hulls. Workers move with purpose, but also with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from months of 18-hour days. Everyone knows the war's outcome hangs in the balance, and every rivet, every weld, every correctly installed piece of equipment might be the difference between victory and defeat. And there moored at Pier 4 sits a ship that's about to become the center of one of the most enduring mysteries in naval history. The USS Eldridge, hull number DE-1773, doesn't look like much. She's a cannon-class destroyer escort about 300 feet long and weighing in at around 200 tons when fully loaded. To the untrained eye, she's just another gray warship in a harbor full of gray warships. Her job is supposed to be simple: protect convoys from submarine attacks, maybe sink a U-boat if she gets lucky. But if the legends are true, the Eldridge is about to become something far more significant. She's about to become the test subject for an experiment so radical, so dangerous that it will challenge everything we think we know about physics, reality, and the nature of existence itself. Picture the ship in detail. Her steel hull gleams with fresh paint, that standard Navy gray that's supposed to make ships harder to spot against the ocean. Her superstructure bristles with radio antennas, radar equipment, and the latest in 1940s naval technology. Steam rises from her stacks as her engines warm up. The deck vibrates with the low throb of powerful machinery. But there's something different about the Eldridge today. Something that makes the other sailors give her a wide berth. Maybe it's the unusual equipment being loaded aboard. Strange, bulky generators that don't match anything in the standard Navy inventory. Maybe it's the civilian scientists who've been coming and going at all hours, carrying briefcases and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Or maybe it's just the feeling in the air, that electric sense of anticipation mixed with dread that comes before something momentous is about to happen. The crew assigned to this experiment, if that's really what it is, are hand-picked volunteers. Or at least that's what the official reports would claim later. Young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who signed up to fight fascism and found themselves instead volunteering for something that sounds more like science fiction than naval warfare. They've been briefed, sworn to secrecy, and told that what they're about to participate in could change the course of the war. What they haven't been told is that some of them might not survive it. And those who do survive, well, they might wish they hadn't. According to the legend, And remember, we're still in Hollywood territory here, the version of events that makes for good storytelling. The experiment begins at precisely 0900 hours on a crisp October morning in 1943. The massive generators that have been installed aboard the Eldridge begin to hum to life. These aren't ordinary ship's generators. They're experimental devices allegedly based on theoretical work by some of the greatest scientific minds of the era. The sound they make is unlike anything the dock workers have ever heard. A deep, resonant thrumming that seems to vibrate in your bone. As the power builds, strange things begin to happen. The air around the ship starts to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot asphalt on a summer day. But this is October and the air is cold. The shimmer isn't from heat, it's from something else entirely. Something that makes the hair on your arms stand up and your teeth ache. The few witnesses who claim to have been there describe a feeling of wrongness, as if the very fabric of reality is being stretched thin. Seagulls flying overhead suddenly veer away from the ship as if hitting an invisible wall. The water around the Eldridge's hull begins to churn and bubble, though there's no wind to speak of. And then the impossible happens. A fog begins to form around the ship, but this isn't ordinary fog. It's a strange luminescent mist that seems to glow with its own inner light. Green, some witnesses say. Others describe it as blue-white, like electrical discharge. The fog grows thicker and more opaque, wrapping around the Eldridge like a cocoon. The humming from the generators grows louder, more intense. It's no longer just a sound you hear. It's something you feel in your chest, in your bones, in the very core of your being. Workers on nearby ships report feeling nauseated, disoriented. Some claim their metal tools become magnetized, sticking to the steel decks without explanation. And then, in a moment that allegedly changed everything, the fog reaches a critical density. The USS Eldridge begins to fade. This is where the story moves from merely unusual to absolutely impossible. According to the most dramatic versions of the legend, the Eldridge doesn't just become hard to see. It becomes completely invisible. Not transparent, not translucent, but genuinely invisible, as if it has been erased from existence. But here's where it gets really interesting. The ship doesn't just disappear from sight. It disappears from the water itself. Where a 200-ton destroyer escort was floating just moments before, there's now nothing but a ship-shaped depression in the surface of the harbor. The water doesn't rush in to fill the void immediately. Instead, it holds that impossible shape for several long seconds, as if the ocean itself is confused about what just happened. Think of it like a graphics card glitching in a video game, but the video game is our reality, and the graphics card is a 200-ton destroyer packed with experimental technology and 200 human beings. The witnesses, or the people who claim to be witnesses decades later, describe a moment of complete stunned silence. Even the constant background noise of the shipyard seems to pause. No hammering, no welding, no shouting of orders. Just dead silence and the impossible sight of empty water where a ship should be. But the silence doesn't last long, because what happens next is even more impossible than what just occurred. Here's where the Philadelphia experiment legend really goes off the rails into pure science fiction territory. According to the story, the Eldridge doesn't just turn invisible and sit there. No, that would be too simple. Instead, the ship allegedly teleports, instantly transports itself across hundreds of miles of ocean to appear briefly at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. Picture this: you're a sailor on duty at Norfolk, maybe having a quiet smoke on the pier, watching the regular traffic of ships coming and going. It's a normal October day, nothing unusual happening. The war feels far away from this peaceful Virginia harbor. And then, without warning, a destroyer escort materializes out of thin air right in front of you. Not approaching from the horizon like ships are supposed to do. Not emerging from behind some obstruction. Literally materializing like something out of a magician's stage show, but involving 200 tons of steel and human beings. The witnesses at Norfolk, again people who came forward years later with their stories, described the Eldridge as appearing ghost-like and translucent during its brief manifestation. They could see through the ship's hull to the water beyond as if it wasn't entirely there. The ship's outline flickered and wavered like a mirage or a reflection on disturbed water. But the most disturbing part of the Norfolk sighting wasn't the ship itself. It was the crew. According to these later testimonies, sailors could be seen on the deck of the flickering destroyer, but they weren't moving normally. Some appeared to be frozen in place like statues. Others moved in slow motion as if they were underwater or caught in some kind of temporal distortion. And their faces. The witnesses who claimed to see them described expressions of absolute terror. Men who looked like they were screaming, but no sound carried across the water. Sailors who appeared to be reaching out for help that would never come. The entire apparition lasted only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the USS Eldridge flickered out of existence again, leaving only confused witnesses and the kind of story that would be laughed out of any official report. But the ship's journey wasn't over, because according to the legend, it was about to return to Philadelphia carrying with it a cargo of horror that would haunt the Navy for decades to come. Back in Philadelphia, the depression in the water where the Eldridge had been suddenly begins to churn and bubble. The strange, luminescent fog starts to reform, growing thicker and more opaque by the second. The electrical humming that had accompanied the ship's disappearance returns even more intense than before. And then, like a photographic negative slowly developing, the USS Eldridge begins to rematerialize. But something is terribly, horribly wrong. The ship that returns is not the same ship that vanished. Oh, it looks the same from a distance. Same gray hull, same superstructure, same overall configuration. But as the fog clears and the full horror of what has happened becomes visible, it becomes clear that the experiment has gone catastrophically wrong. This is where the legend of the Philadelphia experiment transitions from science fiction spectacle to genuine horror story. Because what allegedly happened to the crew of the Eldridge during their journey through whatever dimension or reality they visited is the stuff of nightmares. When the ship reappeared in Philadelphia Harbor, the scene on deck was wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong in ways that challenge everything we understand about how the world is supposed to work. Some of the crew members were found in a state of what witnesses would later describe as complete mental dissociation. These men were technically alive, but they stared straight ahead with empty eyes, unresponsive to questions, commands, or even physical contact. They moved when directed, but showed no signs of independent thought or awareness. It was as if their consciousness had been left behind in whatever dimension the ship had traveled to. Other crew members were found in states of extreme psychological distress. They screamed about seeing through time, about watching their own deaths play out in endless loops, about experiencing every moment of their lives simultaneously. These men had to be sedated and removed to secure psychiatric facilities where most of them would spend the rest of their lives. But the psychological casualties, disturbing as they were, weren't the worst of it. The worst were the men who had been physically affected by whatever force had transported the ship. And this is where the story becomes almost too horrific to tell, even in the context of wartime experimentation gone wrong. 5 crew members were found fused with the ship itself. Let me paint you a picture as gently as possible given the subject matter. You're not looking at a sailor standing on the deck. You're looking at a sailor who has become part of the deck. His arm, his shoulder, his torso merged with the steel bulkhead as if the metal had been molten when he touched it, then cooled around his body. The boundary between human flesh and ship steel doesn't exist anymore. It's not that he's stuck to the ship. He is the ship, and the ship is him. Imagine the surreal, silent horror of discovering something like that. A human face emerging from what should be solid metal eyes, still moving mouth, still trying to form words. It's a sight that would break anyone's mind, a violation of natural law so profound that it challenges your basic understanding of what's possible in our reality. The technical term for what allegedly happened to these men is molecular cohesion failure. a fancy way of saying that the boundaries between different types of matter simply stopped working correctly. The electromagnetic experiment that was supposed to make the ship invisible had somehow interfered with the fundamental forces that keep atoms and molecules separate and distinct. It's the kind of workplace accident that no safety manual could ever prepare you for. There's no OSHA form for accidental quantum entanglement with company property. No workers' compensation claim for molecular fusion with military hardware. No protocol for explaining to a man's family that he's technically still alive, but permanently integrated into the superstructure of a Navy destroyer. According to the legend, the Navy's response to this disaster was swift and comprehensive. The surviving crew members who could still function were immediately transferred to different assignments scattered across the fleet to prevent them from comparing notes or stories. Those who had suffered psychological breaks were quietly committed to military psychiatric facilities under cover stories about combat fatigue and operational stress. The men who had been fused with the ship. Well, that's where the story gets really dark. Some versions of the legend claim they were kept alive for study, becoming permanent test subjects for scientists trying to understand what had gone wrong. Other versions suggest they were mercy killed, euthanized to end their suffering and eliminate evidence of the experiment. The most disturbing version of the story suggests that at least one of these fused sailors remained conscious and aware, trapped in his steel prison for years after the experiment. Allegedly, late-night security guards at the shipyard would sometimes hear muffled screaming coming from inside the hull of the Eldridge, growing weaker and less frequent as time passed until finally falling silent altogether. The ship itself was rapidly decommissioned and sold to the Greek Navy, where it served for decades under the name Ethos. Whether this was a genuine sale or simply a way to get the cursed vessel as far away from American waters as possible is a matter of debate among conspiracy theorists. All records of the experiment were classified at the highest levels. Witnesses were debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and transferred to assignments where they would have no contact with anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The official position became that no such experiment had ever taken place, that the USS Eldridge had never been in Philadelphia during the time frame in question, and that anyone claiming otherwise was suffering from delusions or seeking attention. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially secrets as bizarre and horrific as this one. Over the years that followed, rumors began to circulate in Navy bars and veteran organizations. Stories about a ship that could turn invisible, about sailors who had been merged with steel, about an experiment so classified that even asking questions about it could end your career. Most people who heard these stories dismissed them as the kind of tall tales that always spring up around military operations. But a few took them seriously. A few began to ask questions, to dig deeper, to look for evidence that something extraordinary and extraordinarily horrible had happened in Philadelphia Harbor in 1943. One of those people was a man named Morris K. Jessup, an astrophysicist and UFO researcher who would receive a series of letters in the 1950s that would thrust the Philadelphia experiment into the public consciousness and create a legend that persists to this day. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we can understand how this story became public knowledge, we need to understand what might have actually happened. If anything happened at all. Was the Philadelphia experiment real? Did the Navy really conduct such a dangerous and ultimately disastrous test? Or is the entire story the product of one man's imagination amplified by decades of speculation and embellishment? The truth, as we'll discover, is far more complex and disturbing than either the believers or the skeptics would have you believe. Our story now jumps forward more than a decade from the alleged events of 1943 to the mid-1950s. The world has changed dramatically. World War II is over, the atomic age has begun, and the Cold War is just getting started. UFO sightings are making headlines, science fiction is becoming mainstream entertainment, and the American public is just beginning to grapple with the idea that their government might be keeping secrets from them. Into this atmosphere of growing skepticism and scientific wonder steps Dr. Morris Ketchum Jessup, a man whose life would become inextricably linked with the Philadelphia experiment legend, even though he almost certainly had nothing to do with the original events. Jessup wasn't some fringe conspiracy theorist or publicity-seeking crank. He was a legitimate scientist with impressive credentials. Born in 1900 in Indiana, he had earned a master's degree in astronomy from the University of Michigan and spent years working at observatories studying binary star systems and variable stars. He had published papers in respected scientific journals and seemed destined for a conventional academic career. But somewhere along the way, Morris Jessup took a turn toward the unconventional. Maybe it was his experiences during World War II when he worked on classified projects for the Navy. Maybe it was his growing fascination with unexplained phenomena. Or maybe he just got tired of studying distant stars and wanted to investigate mysteries closer to home. By the early 1950s, Jessup had become deeply interested in the UFO phenomenon. Not as a believer or a debunker, but as a scientist trying to apply rigorous investigation to reports that seemed to defy conventional explanation. He traveled around the country interviewing witnesses, collecting reports, and trying to find patterns in the chaos of UFO sightings. In 1955, he published a book called The Case for the UFO, which attempted to provide a scientific framework for understanding flying saucer reports. The book wasn't a huge commercial success, but it gained attention in the small but growing community of serious UFO researchers. Jessup argued that UFOs might be operated by an advanced civilization possibly from outer space, and that their technology operated on principles that conventional science hadn't yet discovered. It was a respectable, if controversial, position for a scientist to take. But Jessup's life was about to take a turn toward the bizarre that would make his UFO research seem mundane by comparison. Sometime in early 1956, Morris Jessup received a letter that would change his life forever. It was handwritten in a mixture of different colored inks, blue, green, black, with certain words capitalized seemingly at random, and others underlined multiple times for emphasis. The return address was from someone calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende, writing from a rural route in Pennsylvania. Imagine being Jessup and opening this letter. You're trying to do serious research into unexplained phenomena, and you get mail that looks like it was written during a fever dream by someone with access to a rainbow of ink pens. Your first instinct would probably be to toss it in the bin labeled crazies and get back to your real work. But something about this particular letter caught Jessup's attention. Maybe it was the level of technical detail, or the way the writer seemed to reference legitimate scientific concepts alongside wild claims. Or maybe it was just the sheer specificity of the story being told. Details so bizarre and particular that they didn't sound like the usual UFO fantasies. The letter began innocuously enough with Allende praising Jessup's book and claiming to have additional information about anti-gravity technology. But then, it took a sharp turn into territory that must have made Jessup's head spin. Allende claimed to have been a crew member aboard a merchant ship called the SS Andrew Fearseth in October 1943. According to his story, the Fearseth had been docked near the USS Eldridge at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard when the Navy conducted a secret experiment designed to make the destroyer invisible to enemy detection. But this wasn't just about radar invisibility, Allende claimed. The experiment had made the ship completely invisible to the human eye, and had resulted in horrific consequences for the crew. He wrote about sailors being frozen in time, others going insane, and some being physically merged with the ship's structure in ways that defied comprehension. The letter was filled with technical-sounding terminology, references to magnetic fields, unified field theory, and electromagnetic bottle. But it was also riddled with apparent misspellings, grammatical errors, and the kind of stream of consciousness rambling that suggested either mental instability or an attempt to sound more credible by including lots of scientific jargon. Jessup might have dismissed the first letter as the work of someone with an overactive imagination, but a few months later, he received a second letter from Carlos Allende. This one was even more detailed and disturbing than the first. In the second letter, Allende provided what he claimed were specific details about the experiment and its aftermath. He named crew members who had allegedly been affected, described the exact nature of the invisibility effect, and claimed to have witnessed the ship's brief appearance at Norfolk Naval Base. But more unsettling than the details of the experiment itself were Allende's claims about what had happened to the crew afterward. He described sailors who had gained the ability to walk through walls but couldn't control it, men who would suddenly freeze and become invisible to everyone around them, and others who had suffered complete mental breakdowns as a result of their experience. According to Allende, some of the affected crew members had been quietly discharged from the Navy and were living in obscurity, too traumatized to speak about what they had experienced. Others had been committed to psychiatric institutions. A few had simply disappeared, their fates unknown. The letter included what Allende claimed were the real names of some of these men, along with details about where they had lived and worked after the experiment. It was the kind of specific checkable information that could either prove his story was true or reveal it as an elaborate fabrication. Jessup was intrigued enough to begin his own investigation. He tried to track down some of the people Allende had mentioned, but found that many of the names and addresses led nowhere. Some of the men Allende claimed to have known were real people who had served in the Navy during World War II, but none of them seemed to have any connection to the events described in the letters. The third letter from Carlos Allende arrived in early 1957, and it was different in tone from the first two. Where the earlier letters had been rambling and somewhat incoherent, this one seemed more focused and urgent. Allende claimed that he was writing to warn Jessup about the dangers of investigating the Philadelphia experiment too deeply. According to this letter, the Navy was still conducting research based on what they had learned from the 1943 experiment. The technology that had caused such horrific results was being refined and developed for future military applications. Allende claimed that powerful people in the government and military were watching anyone who showed too much interest in the subject. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Allende claimed that the effects of the original experiment were still ongoing. Some of the surviving crew members, he wrote, were still experiencing time slips and involuntary invisibility episodes more than a decade after the experiment. The electromagnetic fields that had been used to make the ship invisible had somehow permanently altered the men who were exposed to them. This letter also contained what appeared to be a veiled threat. Allende suggested that Jessup should abandon his investigation before he attracted the wrong kind of attention from people who wouldn't hesitate to silence him if they thought he was getting too close to the truth. Reading between the lines, it seemed like Allende was genuinely frightened, not just of the technology itself, but of the people who controlled it. Whether his fear was justified or simply the product of paranoid delusions was impossible to determine from the letters alone. Despite Allende's warnings, or perhaps because of them, Jessup decided to dig deeper into the Philadelphia experiment claims. He was a trained scientist after all, and he knew how to conduct research. If there was any truth to Allende's story, he was determined to find it. Jessup began by trying to verify the basic facts of Allende's account. Had the USS Eldridge actually been in Philadelphia in October 1943? Had there been any unusual experiments conducted at the naval shipyard during that time period? Were any of the people Allende mentioned real individuals who could be contacted and interviewed? What Jessup discovered was frustrating and inconclusive. Naval records from World War II were still largely classified in the 1950s, making it difficult to verify ship movements and experimental programs. The few records that were publicly available didn't show the USS Eldridge being in Philadelphia during the time frame Allende had specified. But the absence of evidence wasn't necessarily evidence of absence. If the experiment had been as highly classified as Allende claimed, it made sense that official records would either be unavailable or deliberately falsified to cover up what had really happened. Jessup did manage to track down a few former Navy personnel who had been stationed at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during 1943, but none of them remembered anything unusual happening during the period in question. Of course, if they had been sworn to secrecy, they wouldn't be likely to admit it to a civilian researcher more than a decade later. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Allende himself proved to be remarkably elusive. Jessup tried to contact him directly, but letters sent to the addresses provided in the correspondence were returned as undeliverable. It was as if Carlos Allende had simply vanished, leaving behind only his bizarre letters and their impossible claims. Just when Jessup was beginning to think that the Philadelphia experiment might be nothing more than an elaborate hoax, something happened that changed everything. In the spring of 1957, he received a phone call from the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. The caller identified himself as Commander George Hoover, and he had a very unusual request. The ONR had received a package in the mail containing a copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, along with a cover letter that simply said Happy Easter. But this wasn't just any copy of the book. It had been extensively annotated by hand with hundreds of comments written in the margins by what appeared to be 3 different people. Commander Hoover wanted to know if Jessup would be willing to come to Washington to examine the book and help them understand what they were looking at. Now let's pause here for a moment. The United States Navy, the actual Pentagon, had received a book scribbled on by unknown individuals and taken it seriously enough to call in the author for consultation. If that's not suspicious, I don't know what is. It's like the IRS deciding to publish a financial guide based on comments written by some random guy on Reddit. When Jessup arrived in Washington and examined the annotated book, he was stunned by what he found. The 3 commentators, who had signed their notes as Jimmy and Mr. A and Mr. B, seemed to have an intimate knowledge of UFO technology and propulsion systems. But more disturbing was the fact that their comments appeared to confirm many of the details that Carlos Allende had provided in his letters. The annotations discussed force fields, magnetic bottles, and levitation in terms that suggested the writers had direct experience with such technology. They made references to different types of extraterrestrial beings and their various spacecraft, writing about them with the casual familiarity of someone discussing different makes and models of automobiles. But most shocking of all were the specific references to the Philadelphia experiment. The annotators seemed to know details about the experiment that Allende had never mentioned in his letters to Jessup. They wrote about the technical aspects of the invisibility field, the specific electromagnetic frequencies that had been used, and the exact nature of the effects on the crew members. The handwriting analysis conducted by the Navy suggested that while there were 3 distinct writing styles in the annotations, they might all have been produced by the same person using different pens and writing techniques. This raised the possibility that a single individual was pretending to be multiple commentators, perhaps to make their claims seem more credible. But if that was the case, it was an incredibly sophisticated deception. The 3 voices in the annotations had distinctly different personalities and areas of expertise. Jimmy seemed to be the most technical, with detailed knowledge of electromagnetic theory and propulsion systems. Mr. A appeared to be more interested in the biological effects of the technology, while Mr. B focused on the operational and strategic implications. The annotations also contained information that hadn't been published anywhere else at the time. They made accurate predictions about scientific discoveries that wouldn't be made for several more years, and they referenced classified military projects that the general public had no way of knowing about. Most unsettling of all was the tone of the annotations. The writers seemed genuinely concerned about the implications of the Philadelphia experiment and similar research. They warned about the dangers of manipulating electromagnetic fields without fully understanding the consequences, and they expressed sympathy for the crew members who had been affected by the experiment. What happened next was perhaps the most bizarre aspect of the entire Philadelphia experiment saga. The Office of Naval Research was so intrigued by the annotated book that they decided to have it reproduced for a wider distribution within the military and intelligence communities. They contracted with Varro Manufacturing Company in Garland, Texas, to produce a limited edition reprint of Jessup's book that included all of the handwritten annotations. Only 127 copies were printed, and they were distributed to a select group of military officials, scientists, and intelligence analysts. Think about this for a moment. The United States Navy took a book that had been randomly annotated by unknown individuals and officially published it for internal distribution. They spent taxpayer money to reproduce the ravings of what might have been complete strangers, simply because those ravings seemed to contain information that the Navy found credible or at least worth investigating. The existence of the Varro edition has been confirmed by multiple sources over the years. Copies occasionally surface at auctions or in estate sales, selling for thousands of dollars to collectors of military memorabilia and conspiracy theory artifacts. The fact that the Navy was willing to put their official imprimatur on such unusual material suggests that they either knew more about the Philadelphia experiment than they were willing to admit publicly, or they were taking the possibility very seriously indeed. While the Navy was busy reproducing annotated books and conducting classified investigations, Morris Jessup was still trying to solve the fundamental mystery: who was Carlos Allende, and was his story true? The breakthrough came in the late 1950s, when other researchers managed to track down the real identity of the mysterious letter writer. Carlos Miguel Allende turned out to be Carl Meredith Allen, a drifter and merchant seaman from Pennsylvania, who had a long history of what we might charitably call creative storytelling. Allen was born in 1925 and had served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. He was intelligent and well-read, with a particular interest in science and technology, but he also had a reputation among those who knew him as someone who enjoyed spinning elaborate tales and pulling elaborate pranks. When investigators finally tracked Allen down and confronted him about the Philadelphia experiment letters, his response was complicated. Sometimes he would insist that every word he had written was true, providing additional details and claiming to have more witnesses who could corroborate his story. Other times he would admit that he had made parts of it up, but claim that the basic story was still true even if some of the details were fabricated. Allen seemed to enjoy the attention that his letters had generated, and he wasn't above embellishing his story when he thought it would make him seem more important or credible. But even his admissions of fabrication were inconsistent. He would claim that one detail was made up, then later insist that it was actually true, and that he had only said it was fake to throw off government investigators who he believed were harassing him. Modern analysis of Carl Allen's letters and behavior suggests that he was probably what psychologists would classify as a confabulator, someone who creates elaborate false memories and stories, often mixing real experiences with fantasy in ways that even they might not be able to untangle. Allen had definitely served in the Merchant Marine during World War II, and he had probably been in various East Coast ports during the time period when the Philadelphia experiment allegedly took place. It's possible that he witnessed some kind of unusual naval experiment or testing, perhaps involving radar technology or electromagnetic equipment, and his imagination filled in the gaps with increasingly fantastic details. The psychological profile that emerges from Allen's correspondence is of an intelligent but lonely individual who desperately wanted to be important, to be taken seriously, to have insider knowledge that would make him special. The Philadelphia experiment letters gave him a way to achieve that importance, at least temporarily. But here's where the story gets more complex than simple psychological analysis would suggest. Even if Carl Allen was a fantasist and a fabricator, some of the details in his letters were remarkably prescient. He wrote about electromagnetic effects and field manipulation years before such concepts became widely known. He described experimental technologies that wouldn't be officially acknowledged until decades later. Was Allen simply a very imaginative person who happened to guess correctly about the direction of military research? Was he someone who had access to classified information through his merchant marine service? Or was there some kernel of truth in his fantastic story, even if most of the details were products of his imagination? While Carl Allen seemed to enjoy his brief moment in the spotlight as the primary source for the Philadelphia experiment story, Morris Jessup found that his involvement with the case was taking a heavy toll on his life and career. The scientific community had never been particularly welcoming to Jessup's UFO research, but his association with the Philadelphia experiment made things much worse. Colleagues began to distance themselves from him, and he found it increasingly difficult to get funding for his research or to publish his work in mainstream journals. Jessup became convinced that he was being watched and harassed by government agents who wanted to prevent him from investigating the Philadelphia experiment further. Whether this paranoia was justified or simply the result of stress and professional isolation is difficult to determine, but there's no doubt that Jessup's mental state was deteriorating. In 1958, Jessup began working on a new book that would have revealed everything he had learned about the Philadelphia experiment and related government cover-ups. But the book was never completed. On April 20th, 1959, Morris Jessup was found dead in his car in a park in Coral Gables, Florida. The engine was running, and a hose had been attached to the exhaust pipe and fed into the car's interior. The official ruling was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Jessup had been struggling with financial problems and professional disappointment, and he had apparently been drinking heavily in the months before his death. The evidence for suicide seemed clear-cut, but conspiracy theorists immediately seized on Jessup's death as proof that he had been murdered to prevent him from revealing the truth about the Philadelphia experiment. They pointed to the fact that Jessup had seemed to be in good spirits just days before his death, and that he had been actively working on new research projects. Even after Jessup's death, Carl Allen continued to make claims about the Philadelphia experiment. In interviews with other researchers throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he added new details to his story and claimed to have additional evidence that he had never shared with Jessup. But Allen's later claims became increasingly outlandish and contradictory. He began talking about time travel, parallel dimensions, and contact with extraterrestrial beings. He claimed that the Philadelphia experiment had opened doorways to other realities, and that some of the affected crew members were still alive, but existing in a different dimension. These later elaborations made it even more difficult to separate any possible truth from obvious fiction in Allen's account. By the time he died in 1994, Allen had told so many different versions of his story that it was impossible to determine which, if any, of his claims were based on real experiences. Despite the apparent unreliability of Carl Allen as a witness, and despite the tragic fate of Morris Jessup, the basic questions raised by the Philadelphia experiment correspondents remain unanswered even today. Did the Navy conduct electromagnetic experiments on ships during World War II? Almost certainly yes. Degaussing technology was real and important for protecting ships from magnetic mines. Did any of these experiments go beyond simple degaussing to explore more exotic applications of electromagnetic fields? Possibly. The Navy was desperate for any technological advantage during the war, and they were funding research into all kinds of unconventional weapons and defense systems. Did any such experiments result in the dramatic effects described in Allen's letters? Almost certainly not. The physics involved would require energy levels far beyond anything available in 1943. But could there have been some kind of unusual incident involving electromagnetic equipment and a destroyer escort that later got embellished into the fantastic story we know today? That's harder to rule out completely. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in Philadelphia in 1943, or what Carl Allen really saw or thought he saw. But the story he told and the way it captured the imagination of people like Morris Jessup and countless others tells us something important about the intersection of science secrecy and the human need to believe that there are still mysteries in the world waiting to be solved. For 8 decades now, the United States Navy has maintained the same basic position regarding the Philadelphia experiment. It never happened. And no such experiment was ever conducted. The science described in the allegations is impossible. The USS Eldridge was never in Philadelphia during the time frame in question. The whole thing is a fantasy based on misunderstandings and deliberate fabrications. Their official response for 80 years has basically been a corporate military-grade new phone who When pressed for details, Navy spokesmen have consistently pointed to a few key facts that they claim definitively debunk the Philadelphia experiment story. The ship's logbooks show it was nowhere near Philadelphia in October 1943. The technology described in the allegations didn't exist in 1943 and violates known laws of physics. There are no records of any such experiment in Navy archives. Case closed. But here's the thing about official denials, they're only as credible as the organization making them. And when it comes to classified military research, especially research that might have gone catastrophically wrong, the Navy has every reason to deny that such experiments ever took place, regardless of whether they actually happened or not. Think about it from the Navy's perspective. Even if the Philadelphia experiment had been real and had resulted in the horrific casualties described in the legend, what would be gained by admitting it now? It would expose the military to massive liability claims from the families of affected personnel. It would reveal that the Navy had conducted dangerous human experimentation without proper safeguards. It would undermine public trust in military research programs. And perhaps most importantly, from a national security standpoint, it would confirm that the United States had been working on exotic weapons technology decades earlier than anyone suspected. That's the kind of information that other countries might find very interesting indeed. So when the Navy says the Philadelphia experiment never happened, we have to ask ourselves, are they telling the truth, or are they doing exactly what any large organization would do when faced with allegations of a massive cover-up? One of the strongest pieces of evidence that Philadelphia experiment believers point to is the code name Project Rainbow, which allegedly refers to the invisibility experiments conducted on the USS Eldridge. The problem is that Project Rainbow was a real military project during World War II. It just had nothing to do with making ships invisible. The actual Project Rainbow was a research program focused on developing stealth technology for aircraft, not ships. Specifically, it was an early attempt to create what we would now recognize as radar-absorbing materials and design techniques that would make bombers harder to detect by enemy radar systems. This is a perfect example of how conspiracy theories often take real elements and twist them into something completely different. Yes, there was a Project Rainbow. Yes, it was highly classified. Yes, it involved making military vehicles harder to detect. But it was about making bombers less visible to radar, not making destroyers completely invisible to the human eye. The confusion probably arose because both the real Project Rainbow and the alleged Philadelphia experiment involved the concept of invisibility. Even though they were referring to completely different types of invisibility using completely different technologies. It's like hearing that the government has a classified project called Operation Thunderbolt, and assuming it must involve controlling the weather, when in reality it's just the code name for a new communication system. The name sounds dramatic and mysterious, but the reality is usually much more mundane. Here's where we get to the heart of what probably really happened in Philadelphia in 1943, and why the truth is actually much more interesting than the fiction, even if it's not as dramatic. During World War II, one of the biggest threats to Allied shipping wasn't enemy submarines or surface raiders, it was magnetic mines. These ingenious weapons would sit on the ocean floor or float just below the surface, waiting for a ship with a strong magnetic signature to pass overhead. When they detected the magnetic field generated by a steel hull, they would explode, often breaking the ship's back and sending it to the bottom in minutes. The solution to this problem was a technology called degaussing, which involved wrapping ships in electrical cables and running carefully calibrated electric currents through them. This created an electromagnetic field that would cancel out the ship's natural magnetic signature, making it effectively invisible to magnetic mines. Degaussing was essentially making a ship invisible to magnetic detection systems that were waiting on the ocean floor like big, dumb, explosive metal fish. It's not about fooling the human eye, it's about fooling a magnetic sensor. It's less Star Trek cloaking device and more like putting on a really, really good disguise to avoid your landlord when the rent's due. Now here's where it gets interesting. Degaussing equipment in 1943 was new, experimental, and not fully understood. The electromagnetic fields required were much stronger than anything most people had ever been exposed to. When degaussing systems were activated, they could cause all kinds of unusual effects. Metal objects would become temporarily magnetized. Compasses would spin wildly. Radio equipment would malfunction. In some cases, the electromagnetic fields were strong enough to cause a faint glow around metal objects, a phenomenon similar to St. Elmo's fire. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against the Philadelphia experiment claims is the official logbook of the USS Eldridge itself. According to these records, which are now declassified and available to researchers, the ship was nowhere near Philadelphia during the time frame when the experiment allegedly took place. In October 1943, when Carl Allen claimed to have witnessed the invisibility experiment, the USS Eldridge was actually in the Bahamas conducting routine sea trials and training exercises. The ship's logbook shows a detailed record of its activities during this period, including daily position reports, weather observations, and routine maintenance activities. The ship's own diary, the boring black and white official paperwork, says it was probably enjoying some sun in the Caribbean while it was supposedly teleporting around the East Coast. The Eldridge didn't arrive in Philadelphia until August 1944, nearly a year after the alleged experiment took place. Of course, a true believer would say, that's what they want you to think, they faked the logs. And that's always the problem with conspiracy theories. Any evidence that contradicts the theory can be dismissed as part of the cover-up. But if the Navy was going to fake logbooks to cover up the Philadelphia experiment, wouldn't they have done a better job? Wouldn't they have created records showing the ship in some completely different location, rather than just a few hundred miles away in the Bahamas? The fact that the logbooks show the ship in a relatively nearby location during routine training exercises actually makes them seem more credible, not less. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for the Philadelphia experiment is the testimony of witnesses who claim to see a strange green or blue glow surrounding the USS Eldridge before it disappeared. This otherworldly luminescence has been interpreted as proof that exotic electromagnetic fields were being generated around the ship, but sailors and maritime workers have a much more mundane explanation for mysterious glows around ship St. Elmo's fire. St. Elmo's fire is a well-documented atmospheric phenomenon that occurs when electrical charge builds up in the atmosphere around pointed or elevated objects. During thunderstorms or in areas with high electromagnetic activity, ships' masts, radio antennas, and other metal protrusions can develop a distinctive blue or green glow. The phenomenon is named after Saint Erasmus of Formia, the patron saint of sailors, who supposedly appeared to Mediterranean sailors as a glowing light during storms. Sailors have been reporting St. Elmo's fire for thousands of years, long before anyone had heard of electromagnetic experiments or invisibility rays. What makes this explanation particularly relevant to the Philadelphia experiment is that degaussing operations would have created exactly the kind of electromagnetic environment that could trigger St. Elmo's fire. The powerful electrical currents running through the degaussing cables would have charged the atmosphere around the ship, potentially causing the kind of eerie glow that witnesses described. So the eerie, otherworldly green glow that allegedly preceded the ship's disappearance might have just been weather. Yeah, a bit of an anticlimax, isn't it? It's like finding out the monster under your bed is just a pile of laundry, or discovering that the strange noises in your attic are just squirrels, not poltergeists. Another factor that needs to be considered when evaluating Philadelphia experiment claims is the extraordinary level of secrecy that surrounded all military operations during World War II. Everything was classified, everything was compartmentalized, and workers were specifically told not to ask questions about activities outside their immediate responsibilities. In this environment, it would have been very easy for rumors and misunderstandings to develop. A dock worker might see unusual equipment being loaded onto a ship and assume it was some kind of secret weapon. A sailor might witness a degaussing test and not understand what he was looking at. A merchant mariner might observe routine naval exercises and interpret them as evidence of exotic experimentation. When you combine normal wartime secrecy with the kind of unusual electromagnetic phenomena that degaussing equipment could produce, you have all the ingredients necessary for urban legends and conspiracy theories to develop. It's also worth noting that the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was one of the most active military installations in the country during World War II. Hundreds of ships passed through the facility for construction, repair, and modification. Experimental equipment was being tested constantly. If you were a civilian worker at the shipyard, you would have seen strange things on a regular basis. most of them perfectly legitimate military research that you simply weren't cleared to know about. One of the biggest red flags in the Philadelphia experiment story is the timing of when witnesses came forward with their accounts. Carl Allen didn't write his letters to Morris Jessup until 1956, more than 13 years after the alleged experiment. Other witnesses didn't surface until decades later, often after books or movies about the Philadelphia experiment had already been published. This is a classic pattern in conspiracy theories and urban legends. Initial reports are vague and often secondhand. Then, as the story gains publicity, more witnesses emerge with increasingly detailed accounts that seem to confirm and expand on the original claims. The problem is that human memory is notoriously unreliable, especially over long periods of time. Studies have shown that our recollections of events can be heavily influenced by information we learn after the fact. If someone witnessed a routine degaussing test in 1943 but didn't think much of it at the time, they might later remember much more dramatic details after reading about the Philadelphia experiment in books or magazines. This doesn't necessarily mean that all the later witnesses were lying or deliberately fabricating their stories. Many of them probably believed that their memories were accurate, but the influence of suggestion and the natural tendency of memory to fill in gaps with plausible details could easily account for the increasingly elaborate nature of the witness testimonies. From a purely scientific standpoint, the kind of invisibility described in the Philadelphia experiment allegations is not just unlikely, it's impossible given our current understanding of physics. And this isn't just a matter of the technology not existing in 1943. The fundamental physics involved would require energy levels that are beyond anything humans have ever produced. To make an object invisible to visible light, you would need to bend electromagnetic radiation around it in such a way that light waves pass by without interacting with the object's surface. This is theoretically possible using something called a metamaterial, an artificially engineered material with properties that don't exist in nature. But here's the problem. Even modern metamaterials can only affect very specific wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, and they only work for objects that are much smaller than the wavelengths they're designed to manipulate. Making a 300-foot destroyer invisible to visible light would require metamaterials that don't exist today and might never be possible to create. And that's just optical invisibility. The Philadelphia experiment allegations go much further, claiming that the ship was able to teleport across hundreds of miles of ocean. This would require manipulating space-time itself in ways that would demand energy levels comparable to those produced by stars. From a physics standpoint, the Philadelphia experiment is like trying to build a Death Star using only the instructions for a Lego set. The science just isn't there. Not then, and arguably not even now with our much more advanced understanding of electromagnetic theory and quantum mechanics. So if the Philadelphia experiment didn't happen, as described, what did happen? What were Carl Allen and other witnesses actually seeing when they thought they were witnessing impossible science? The most likely explanation is that they witnessed routine but classified naval operations that they didn't understand. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a center for experimental work on radar sonar and electronic countermeasures during World War II. Ships were regularly fitted with new equipment and tested under controlled conditions. A degaussing test conducted at night under wartime blackout conditions could easily have appeared mysterious and otherworldly to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. The electromagnetic fields would have caused unusual lighting effects. The secrecy surrounding the operation would have made it seem more important and dramatic than it really was. It's also possible that some kind of accident or malfunction occurred during one of these tests. Degaussing equipment in 1943 was new and not fully understood. If something went wrong, if the electromagnetic fields were stronger than expected, or if they interfered with other ship systems in unexpected ways, it could have caused the kind of unusual effects that later got embellished into the fantastic story we know today. The truth might be that there was a kernel of reality in Carl Allen's story. He might have genuinely witnessed some kind of unusual naval experiment or accident. But over the years, as the story was retold and embellished, that kernel of truth got buried under layers of fantasy and speculation. In 1999, nearly 60 years after the alleged experiment, the U.S. Navy finally issued a detailed official statement about the Philadelphia experiment. The statement was posted on the Navy's website and addressed many of the specific claims that had been made over the decades. According to this official statement, the USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia during October 1943. Ship logs and other records show that it was conducting sea trials in the Bahamas during that period. No invisibility experiments were ever conducted on the USS Eldridge or any other Navy vessel. The technology described in such experiments did not exist in 1943 and violates known laws of physics. The Navy did conduct research on degaussing technology during World War II, but this research was focused on protecting ships from magnetic mines, not on making them invisible to visual detection. No crew members of the USS Eldridge reported any unusual experiences related to electromagnetic experiments or invisibility effects. The statement went on to explain the real science behind degaussing and to clarify the differences between magnetic invisibility, which is real and was used during the war, and optical invisibility, which is not possible, using the methods described in Philadelphia experiment accounts. Of course, skeptics of the official position argue that this statement proves nothing. If the Navy really had conducted such experiments and they had gone wrong, this is exactly the kind of denial they would issue regardless of what actually happened. One advantage that modern researchers have over earlier investigators like Morris Jessup is access to declassified military documents from World War II. Thousands of pages of previously classified material have been released over the decades, providing unprecedented insight into what the Navy was actually doing during the 1940s. Analysis of these documents has revealed extensive records of legitimate research into electromagnetic technologies, radar systems, and electronic countermeasures. The Navy was indeed conducting cutting-edge research into technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to most people at the time. But nowhere in these documents is there any reference to invisibility experiments, teleportation research, or the kind of exotic physics described in Philadelphia experiment accounts. The research was focused on practical military applications of well-understood electromagnetic principles. The documents do show that the USS Eldridge was involved in various experimental programs during its service life, but these were routine tests of new radar and sonar equipment, not attempts to manipulate space-time or achieve optical invisibility. Perhaps most significantly, the documents include extensive safety protocols and incident reports for electromagnetic research programs. If something as catastrophic as the alleged Philadelphia experiment had occurred, it would have generated massive amounts of paperwork, accident reports, medical records, investigations, safety reviews. None of this documentation exists in the archives. The famous astronomer Carl Sagan once said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The Philadelphia experiment is certainly an extraordinary claim. It alleges that the Navy achieved technology in 1943 that we still can't duplicate today, and that they did so in such a reckless manner that it resulted in horrific casualties. But after 8 decades of investigation, where is the extraordinary evidence to support this extraordinary claim? We have the letters of Carl Allen, who has been shown to be an unreliable narrator with a history of fabrication. We have testimony from witnesses who didn't come forward until decades after the alleged events, often after the story had already been publicized in books and movies. We have no physical evidence, no documentary evidence, and no contemporary accounts from the time period when the experiment allegedly took place. This doesn't prove that the Philadelphia experiment never happened, but it does mean that the burden of proof remains with those who claim it did happen. In the absence of credible evidence, the most reasonable position is to accept the conventional explanation that the story is based on misunderstandings of routine naval operations embellished over time into an increasingly fantastic legend. Understanding what probably really happened in Philadelphia in 1943 isn't just about debunking a conspiracy theory. It's about appreciating the actual scientific and technological achievements of the World War II era, which were remarkable enough without adding impossible elements. The development of radar, sonar, and electromagnetic countermeasures during the war represented genuine breakthroughs that helped determine the outcome of the conflict. Degaussing technology saved thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives by protecting them from magnetic mines. The research conducted at facilities like the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard laid the groundwork for technologies that we still use today. These real achievements don't need to be embellished with stories about invisibility and teleportation to be impressive. The truth about what the Navy was actually doing during World War II is fascinating enough on its own, and it has the additional advantage of being true. To understand why the Philadelphia experiment story has such enduring appeal, we need to dive into some of the real science that was being developed during the 1940s. And there's no better place to start than with Albert Einstein and his obsession with finding what he called the unified field theory. Einstein spent the last 3 decades of his life on this quest. He was trying to find the one master equation that would connect all the fundamental forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and what we now know as the strong and weak nuclear forces. He wanted to discover the God equation that would explain everything from why apples fall from trees to why stars shine in the sky. The idea was that if you could understand the deep connections between these forces, you might be able to manipulate them in ways that would seem like magic to people who didn't understand the underlying physics. You might be able to create artificial gravity or bend light around objects, or even manipulate the flow of time itself. Now, Einstein never succeeded in finding his unified field theory. In fact, physicists are still working on it today using much more sophisticated mathematics and experimental techniques than were available in Einstein's time. But in the 1940s, the possibility that such a breakthrough might be just around the corner seemed very real. And here's where the Philadelphia experiment conspiracy theory gets its hooks into people's imaginations. The theory claims that Einstein did succeed in developing a workable unified field theory, but that instead of publishing it for the benefit of all humanity, he secretly shared it with the US Navy for use in developing superweapons. According to this version of events, the invisibility field that allegedly surrounded the USS Eldridge wasn't just some crude electromagnetic effect. It was the practical application of the deepest secrets of the universe turned into a weapon of war. Now, before we dismiss this idea entirely, it's worth noting that Einstein did have a real connection to military research during World War II. He held a security clearance and worked as a consultant on various classified projects for the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. So it's not completely insane to imagine a conversation happening between Einstein and some ambitious admiral. Picture it, they're sitting in a secure conference room in the Pentagon somewhere around 1942. The admiral leans forward and says, "So, Herr Doctor, this unified field theory of yours, can it make a boat go? Poof." You can just imagine Einstein sighing and trying to explain that theoretical physics doesn't work that way. That even if he could develop a unified field theory, turning it into practical technology would require decades of additional research and engineering development. That the energy requirements alone would be astronomical. But the admiral isn't really listening to the technical details. He's thinking about U-boats torpedoing supply convoys, about the Battle of the Atlantic, being lost about the very real possibility that Nazi Germany might develop some kind of superweapon first. In that context, even the most far-fetched scientific possibilities start to look worth investigating. The truth is that Einstein's actual war work was much more mundane than developing invisibility rays. He consulted on conventional weapons design, helped with calculations for explosive devices, and provided theoretical guidance for various engineering problems. Important work, certainly, but nothing that would have shocked the physics community or revolutionized our understanding of the universe. But conspiracy theorists aren't interested in mundane consulting work. They want to believe that the greatest mind of the 20th century was secretly developing technologies that could change the world, and that those technologies were so dangerous that they had to be hidden from public view. No conspiracy theory about secret government technology would be complete without mentioning Nikola Tesla, and the Philadelphia experiment story doesn't disappoint. According to various versions of the legend, Tesla was either directly involved in developing the invisibility technology, or his research provided the foundation for the experiments. Tesla is the perfect figure for conspiracy theories because his real work was already so far ahead of his time that it seemed like science fiction to his contemporaries. He pioneered alternating current electricity, developed wireless power transmission, and conducted experiments with high-voltage electricity that produced spectacular visual effects. His laboratory demonstrations often looked more like magic shows than scientific research. The Tesla connection to the Philadelphia experiment usually goes something like this. Tesla had discovered the secrets of electromagnetic field manipulation through his experiments with wireless power. He had developed theories about how to use resonant frequencies to control matter and energy. When he died in January 1943, the government seized all of his research notes and used them to develop the invisibility technology tested on the USS Eldridge. The timing certainly seems suspicious from a conspiracy theory perspective. Tesla dies in January 1943. The government confiscates his research, and 9 months later they're supposedly trying to bend space-time with a destroyer escort. It's a compelling timeline, you have to admit. But there are some problems with this narrative. First, while the government did seize Tesla's papers after his death, they were later examined by experts who concluded that most of them contained no useful technical information. Tesla had become increasingly eccentric in his later years, and much of his writing consisted of vague speculation rather than practical engineering data. Second, Tesla's actual area of expertise, high-voltage electricity and wireless power transmission, has very little to do with the kind of field manipulation that would be required for invisibility technology. It's like claiming that someone who invented a better mousetrap must have also discovered the secret of time travel, because both involve mechanical devices. When Tesla died in his room at the New Yorker Hotel in January 1943, the FBI and the Office of Alien Property did indeed seize his papers and personal effects. This wasn't unusual. Tesla was a foreign national who had been working on classified military projects, and standard security protocols required that his research materials be secured. The government's real interest in Tesla's work had nothing to do with invisibility rays or unified field theories. They were concerned about his research into what he called a teleforce weapon, basically an early concept for what we would now recognize as a particle beam weapon or directed energy device. During the 1930s, Tesla had approached various governments, including the United States, with proposals for a defensive weapon system that could shoot down enemy aircraft or disable enemy equipment at a distance. He claimed that his device could project a beam of charged particles with enough energy to destroy targets hundreds of miles away. From a military perspective, this was much more interesting than theoretical physics. If Tesla had actually developed a working particle beam weapon, it could have changed the entire course of World War II. The ability to shoot down enemy bombers before they reached their targets or to disable enemy ships from a safe distance would have been worth almost any price. But when government scientists examined Tesla's notes and prototypes, they found that his teleforce weapon was mostly theoretical. Tesla had identified some real physical principles that could potentially be used to create directed energy weapons, but he was decades away from developing practical technology. The energy requirements were enormous, the engineering challenges were immense, and the materials science needed to build such a device simply didn't exist in 1943. So the government classified Tesla's research and filed it away, not because it was dangerous, but because it wasn't immediately useful. It would be another 40 years before advances in laser technology and particle physics made directed energy weapons practical for military applications. To understand why the Philadelphia experiment claims are scientifically implausible, we need to look at what was actually known about electromagnetic theory in 1943 and what kinds of effects could realistically be produced with the technology available at the time. The basic principles of electromagnetism had been worked out in the 19th century, by scientists like James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday. By the 1940s, engineers had a solid understanding of how to generate, control, and manipulate electromagnetic fields for practical applications like radio, radar, and electric motors. But there's a huge difference between understanding the basic principles of electromagnetism and being able to manipulate those fields in ways that would seem miraculous. It's like the difference between knowing how to ride a bicycle and knowing how to design a rocket ship. They both involve principles of physics, but the level of complexity and sophistication is completely different. The strongest electromagnetic fields that could be practically generated in 1943 were orders of magnitude weaker than what would be needed to produce the effects described in Philadelphia experiment accounts. Making an object invisible to visible light would require field strengths comparable to those found in the cores of neutron stars. Energies that we still can't generate artificially today, much less in 1943. Even the less dramatic effects claimed by some witnesses, like making metal objects temporarily magnetized or causing electrical equipment to malfunction, would require electromagnetic fields strong enough to be dangerous to human health. The kind of field strengths that could magnetize steel tools would also be strong enough to stop human hearts or scramble brain activity. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because the energy requirements for the alleged Philadelphia experiment effects are where the story really falls apart from a scientific perspective. To bend electromagnetic radiation around a 300-foot destroyer escort in a way that would make it invisible to visible light, you would need to create what physicists call a metamaterial with properties that don't exist in nature. Even if such a material could be created, and that's a huge if, it would need to be powered by energy sources that dwarf anything available in 1943. Conservative estimates suggest that making an object the size of the USS Eldridge optically invisible would require continuous power input of at least several hundred megawatts, roughly equivalent to the electrical output of a large power plant. The ship's generators in 1943 could produce maybe a few hundred kilowatts at most, but optical invisibility is nothing compared to the energy requirements for teleportation. Moving a 200-ton object instantaneously across hundreds of miles of space would require manipulating the fundamental structure of space-time itself. According to Einstein's theories, this would demand energy levels comparable to those produced by stellar nucleosynthesis, the nuclear fusion reactions that power stars. To put this in perspective, the amount of energy needed to teleport the USS Eldridge from Philadelphia to Norfolk would be roughly equivalent to the total energy output of the sun for several seconds. That's more energy than humanity has produced in our entire history, concentrated into a few moments and focused on a single ship. From a physics standpoint, this is like trying to build a Death Star using only the instructions for a Lego set and a handful of AA batteries. The science just isn't there. Not then, and arguably not even now with our much more advanced understanding of quantum mechanics and relativistic physics. Interestingly, invisibility research isn't entirely science fiction anymore. Modern physicists and engineers have made real progress toward developing cloaking technologies that can make objects invisible to certain types of electromagnetic radiation. The key breakthrough came with the development of metamaterials, artificially engineered structures with electromagnetic properties that don't exist in natural materials. By carefully controlling the size, shape, and arrangement of tiny metallic elements, researchers can create materials that bend electromagnetic waves in unusual ways. In laboratory settings, scientists have successfully demonstrated invisibility cloaking for microwaves, infrared radiation, and even some wavelengths of visible light. These devices can make small objects, typically a few centimeters across, effectively invisible to specific types of detection systems. But there are enormous limitations to current cloaking technology. The metamaterials only work for very specific wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, so an object that's invisible to red light might be perfectly visible to blue light. The cloaking effect only works from certain viewing angles, and most importantly, the objects that can be cloaked are tiny compared to something like a destroyer escort. Current technology might be able to make a coin invisible to red laser light when viewed from directly above. Making a warship invisible to the human eye under normal lighting conditions is still far beyond our capabilities, and might remain impossible for fundamental physical reasons. Some modern proponents of Philadelphia experiment theories have tried to update the story by incorporating concepts from quantum mechanics, the branch of physics that deals with the behavior of matter and energy at the atomic and subatomic level. These updated theories suggest that the Navy might have stumbled upon some kind of quantum field manipulation technology that allowed them to alter the fundamental properties of matter itself. Instead of simply bending light around the ship, they allegedly found a way to shift the entire vessel into a different quantum state, where it didn't interact normally with the rest of the universe. This sounds sophisticated and scientific, but it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what quantum mechanics actually says about the physical world. Quantum effects are typically only observable at extremely small scales, individual atoms, electrons, and photons. At the scale of a destroyer escort, quantum mechanical effects are completely overwhelmed by classical physics. It's true that quantum mechanics predicts some strange phenomena. Particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously, objects can tunnel through barriers that should be impenetrable, and information can be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances. But these effects become vanishingly small when you scale up from individual particles to macroscopic objects. Making a ship phase into a different quantum state would be like trying to make a mountain transparent by convincing each individual grain of sand to become invisible. Even if you could somehow affect every atom in the ship simultaneously, which would require technology far beyond anything we can imagine, the result wouldn't be invisibility. It would more likely be the complete disintegration of the ship into its component atoms. One reason why Philadelphia experiment theories seem plausible to some people is the very real context of secret government research during World War II. The Manhattan Project, the successful effort to develop atomic weapons, proved that the government was capable of conducting large-scale scientific research programs in complete secrecy. If the government could secretly develop nuclear weapons, the reasoning goes, why couldn't they also have secretly developed invisibility technology? Both would have required cutting-edge physics, massive resources, and unprecedented levels of security. But there are important differences between the Manhattan Project and the alleged Philadelphia experiment. Nuclear weapons were based on well-understood physics. Scientists knew that nuclear fission was possible because they had observed it in laboratory experiments. The engineering challenges were enormous, but the basic science was solid. The Philadelphia experiment, by contrast, would have required physics that was not only unknown in 1943, but which contradicts our current understanding of how the universe works. It's the difference between building a very large, very complex machine based on known principles and discovering entirely new laws of physics that no one had ever imagined. Also, the Manhattan Project involved thousands of scientists and engineers working at multiple facilities across the country. Despite the secrecy, details of the project began leaking out almost immediately after the war ended. The Philadelphia experiment, if it really happened, would have required similar resources and personnel, but it has supposedly remained completely secret for 8 decades. Some Philadelphia experiment proponents argue that conventional physics might be incomplete or incorrect, and that there could be unknown laws of nature that would make invisibility and teleportation possible with 1940s technology. This isn't entirely unreasonable. The history of science is filled with examples of accepted theories being overturned by new discoveries. Newton's laws of motion seemed absolute until Einstein showed that they were just approximations that work well at low speeds. Maybe our current understanding of electromagnetism and space-time is similarly limited. But here's the problem. Any new physics that would make the Philadelphia experiment possible would have to explain not just why invisibility is possible, but why it's only been achieved once in secret with no reproducible results. It would have to account for why the same technology hasn't been developed by other countries, or why it hasn't led to other applications that would be equally revolutionary. Scientific revolutions typically open up entirely new fields of research and technology. When nuclear physics was developed, it led not just to weapons, but to nuclear power, medical imaging, radiometric, dating, and countless other applications. If the Navy really had developed space-time manipulation technology in 1943, where are all the spin-off technologies? Where are the commercial applications? Where are the other experiments? The absence of any follow-up research or development is one of the strongest arguments against the Philadelphia experiment. Claims: real scientific breakthroughs, even classified ones, have consequences that ripple through the entire scientific and technological community. While the Philadelphia experiment, as described, is almost certainly impossible with any conceivable technology, it's worth considering what future advances in physics and engineering might eventually make possible. Current research into metamaterials and transformation optics might eventually lead to cloaking devices that work across broader ranges of wavelengths and for larger objects. Advances in quantum field theory might reveal new ways to manipulate the fundamental forces of nature. Breakthroughs in energy generation and storage might make previously impossible experiments feasible. Some theoretical physicists have proposed concepts like Alcubierre drives that could potentially allow faster-than-light travel by warping space-time around a spacecraft. Others have suggested that quantum entanglement might be used to transmit matter instantaneously across vast distances, a form of teleportation that doesn't violate the laws of physics. But all of these possibilities would require technology that is centuries or millennia beyond our current capabilities. They would need energy sources that we can barely imagine, materials that we don't know how to create, and the understanding of fundamental physics that we haven't achieved yet. The idea that such technology could have been developed in secret in 1943 using vacuum tubes and mechanical calculators stretches credibility beyond the breaking point. Understanding the real science behind electromagnetic phenomena and space-time manipulation isn't just about debunking conspiracy theories. It's about appreciating the genuine achievements of 20th century physics and the ongoing efforts to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The actual scientific work being conducted during World War II was remarkable enough without adding impossible elements. Radar technology revolutionized warfare and later led to everything from microwave ovens to satellite communication. Early computers developed for military calculations laid the groundwork for the digital revolution. Nuclear physics, despite its destructive applications, opened up new understandings of stellar evolution, geological time, and the fundamental structure of matter. These real achievements don't need to be embellished with stories about invisibility and teleportation to be impressive. The truth about what scientists and engineers accomplished during the 1940s is fascinating enough on its own, and it has the additional advantage of being true. Moreover, understanding why the Philadelphia experiment is scientifically implausible helps us develop better critical thinking skills for evaluating other extraordinary claims. The same principles that make invisibility shields impossible also help us understand why perpetual motion machines don't work, why astrology can't predict the future, and why homeopathic remedies can't cure serious diseases. Science isn't just a collection of facts about the natural world. It's a method for distinguishing between what's real and what's wishful thinking. And that's a skill that becomes more valuable every day in our increasingly complex and information-saturated world. By 1958, Morris Jessup's life was falling apart. What had started as legitimate scientific curiosity about unexplained phenomena had transformed into an obsession that was destroying his career, his relationships, and his mental health. The scientific community had never been particularly welcoming to Jessup's UFO research, but his association with the Philadelphia experiment had made things infinitely worse. Colleagues who had once respected his astronomical work now viewed him as a fringe researcher who had abandoned serious science for sensationalism and conspiracy theories. Publishing opportunities dried up. Research grants were denied. Invitations to speak at scientific conferences stopped coming. Jessup found himself increasingly isolated from the academic community that had once been his professional home. But the isolation wasn't just professional, it was personal as well. Jessup had become convinced that he was being watched and harassed by government agents who wanted to prevent him from investigating the Philadelphia experiment further. Whether this paranoia was justified or simply the result of stress and professional disappointment is difficult to determine, but there's no doubt that Jessup's mental state was deteriorating. He reported mysterious phone calls at all hours of the night. He claimed that his mail was being intercepted and read before being delivered. He suspected that his home and office were being searched while he was away. Friends and family members noticed that he was becoming increasingly agitated, suspicious, and depressed. Whether Jessup's fears were based on reality or delusion, they were very real to him, and they were slowly driving him toward a breaking point that would have tragic consequences. In the months before his death, Jessup's correspondence with other UFO researchers became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He wrote about feeling trapped in a web of secrecy and conspiracy that he couldn't escape. He expressed fears that he had stumbled onto information that powerful people didn't want revealed. But most concerning were the hints of despair that crept into his letters. Jessup wrote about feeling like a failure, both as a scientist and as a human being. He expressed regret about the direction his life had taken and doubt about whether his research had accomplished anything meaningful. Some of his correspondents later said that they had been concerned about Jessup's mental state and had tried to reach out to him, but that he had become increasingly isolated and difficult to contact. Phone calls went unreturned, letters received only brief cryptic responses. Invitations to visit or collaborate were declined. In retrospect, these were classic warning signs of someone in severe psychological distress. But in 1959, there was much less awareness of mental health issues and suicide prevention than there is today. The people who knew Jessup could see that he was struggling, but they didn't know how to help him or how serious his condition had become. On the evening of April 20th, 1959, Morris Jessup was found dead in his car in Matheson Hammock Park, a quiet wooded area near Coral Gables, Florida. The engine was still running and a hose had been attached to the exhaust pipe and fed through a window into the car's interior. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. The investigation was routine and brief. Jessup had been struggling with financial problems, professional disappointment, and what appeared to be clinical depression. He had been drinking heavily in the months before his death. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been involved. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide, and most people who knew Jessup accepted that conclusion. He had been a troubled man facing seemingly insurmountable problems, and he had chosen what seemed to him like the only way out. But for conspiracy theorists, Jessup's death was anything but routine. Here was a man who had been investigating one of the most sensitive secrets in military history, and he had died under mysterious circumstances, just as he was supposedly getting close to the truth. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Within days of Jessup's death, rumors began circulating in UFO research circles that he had been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he had learned about the Philadelphia experiment. The fact that he had been working on a new book that would have exposed government cover-ups only added fuel to these speculations. The conspiracy theory around Jessup's death gained traction for several reasons. First, he had seemed to be in relatively good spirits just days before his death, according to some acquaintances. He had been making plans for future research projects and had even scheduled meetings for the following week. Second, the location where his body was found seemed odd to some people. Matheson Hammock Park was not a place that Jessup was known to frequent, and it was unclear why he would have driven there to commit suicide, rather than doing it at home or in some other location that had personal significance. Third, there were reports that Jessup's home and office had been searched shortly after his death, allegedly by government agents looking for his research materials and unpublished manuscripts. Whether these searches actually took place or whether they were conducted by legitimate authorities as part of the death investigation remains unclear. But perhaps most compelling to conspiracy theorists was the question of motive. If the Philadelphia experiment had really happened and the government was still covering it up, Jessup would have represented a significant threat to that secrecy. He was a credentialed scientist with a growing public platform, and he was actively investigating claims that could have embarrassed or implicated military officials. From this perspective, Jessup's death wasn't a tragic suicide. It was a successful assassination disguised as a mental health crisis. While the conspiracy theory around Jessup's death makes for compelling storytelling, the actual evidence strongly supports the official suicide ruling. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Jessup had been struggling with severe depression and financial problems in the months before his death. His drinking had increased dramatically, and he had made several comments to friends and family members that, in retrospect, could be interpreted as suicidal ideation. Moreover, the method of death, carbon monoxide poisoning in a car, was consistent with suicide rather than murder. If government agents had wanted to kill Jessup, they could have chosen methods that would have been much less likely to raise suspicions. A car accident, a heart attack, or a simple disappearance would have been far more effective than staging an elaborate fake suicide. The supposed searches of Jessup's home and office also appear to have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Standard police procedure in any unexplained death includes securing and examining the deceased person's residence and workplace. If investigators were looking for suicide notes, financial records, or other evidence that might explain the death, such searches would have been routine and legitimate. Finally, there's the question of what Jessup actually knew about the Philadelphia experiment. Despite years of investigation, he had never uncovered any hard evidence that the experiment had actually taken place. His research was based entirely on the letters from Carl Allen, which were already known to be unreliable. From a government cover-up perspective, Jessup was much more valuable alive and discredited than dead and potentially martyred. Following Jessup's death, interest in the Philadelphia experiment went into a prolonged decline. Without Jessup to promote and investigate the story, it faded from public consciousness and became little more than a footnote in UFO literature. Carl Allen continued to make occasional claims about the experiment, but his credibility was so damaged by this point that few researchers took him seriously. Other UFO investigators moved on to more recent cases and more promising leads. The Philadelphia experiment seemed destined to become another forgotten conspiracy theory. This quiet period lasted for more than 2 decades. Throughout the 1960s and most of the 1970s, the Philadelphia experiment was rarely mentioned in books, magazines, or conferences about unexplained phenomena. When it was discussed, it was usually dismissed as a historical curiosity with little relevance to current research. But the story wasn't dead, it was just dormant. And in the early 1980s, it would experience a dramatic revival that would transform it from an obscure conspiracy theory into a part of mainstream popular culture. In 1984, a low-budget science fiction film called The Philadelphia Experiment was released to theaters across the United States. Directed by Stuart Raffill and starring Michael Pare and Nancy Allen, the movie took the basic premise of the naval invisibility experiment and turned it into an action-adventure story about time travel and government cover-ups. The film's plot was straightforward. 2 sailors from the USS Eldridge are transported through time during the 1943 experiment and find themselves in 1984, where they discover that the government is still conducting similar research. They must stop a new experiment that threatens to tear apart the fabric of space-time while also trying to find a way back to their own time period. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't a great movie by any cinematic standard. The special effects were cheesy even by 1980 standards. The acting was wooden, and the plot had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese. But it was entertaining enough to find an audience, and it introduced the Philadelphia experiment story to millions of people who had never heard of Morris Jessup or Carl Allen. More importantly, the movie presented the experiment as historical fact, rather than unproven legend. Casual viewers might have assumed that the basic story was true and that Hollywood had simply added fictional elements for dramatic effect. This confusion between fact and fiction would have lasting consequences for how the public understood the Philadelphia experiment claims. Shortly after the movie's release, something extraordinary happened. A man named Alfred Bielek came forward claiming that watching the film had triggered the return of suppressed memories from his own involvement in the Philadelphia experiment. According to Bielek, he was actually Edward Cameron, one of two brothers who had served aboard the USS Eldridge during the 1943 experiment. When the ship began to dematerialize, he and his brother had jumped overboard to escape the effects. Instead of landing in the water, they had been transported through time to the year 1983. Bielek claimed that his memories of these events had been artificially suppressed by government mind control techniques, but that seeing the movie had somehow broken through the mental conditioning and allowed him to remember what had really happened. But this is where the story officially goes off the rails and into deep space. We're now talking about time travel, mind control, secret underground bases, and decades-long government conspiracies to hide the truth about dimensional research. It's a conspiracy theorist's dream buffet with something for everyone who wants to believe that reality is much stranger and more interesting than it appears. Bielek's story was elaborate and detailed. He claimed to remember not just the original 1943 experiment, but also subsequent research programs that had continued the work in secret. He spoke about underground facilities, advanced technologies, and ongoing contact with extraterrestrial beings who were helping the government develop even more exotic capabilities. Bielek's most significant contribution to Philadelphia experiment mythology was his claim that the 1943 invisibility experiment was connected to an even more secret research program called the Montauk Project. According to Bielek and other researchers who picked up his story, the Montauk Project was conducted at Camp Hero, a former military base on the eastern tip of Long Island, New York. The project allegedly involved time travel, mind control, psychic research, and the creation of portals to other dimensions. Bielek claimed that he had been transported from the USS Eldridge in 1943 to Montauk in 1983, where he had been forced to participate in time travel experiments for several months before escaping back to his own timeline. The experience had supposedly given him knowledge of advanced technologies and secret government programs that were still ongoing. The Montauk Project allegations were even more fantastic than the original Philadelphia experiment claims. Researchers at Camp Hero were supposedly able to read and control human thoughts, create matter from pure mental energy, and open doorways to parallel universes. They had allegedly made contact with extraterrestrial beings and were working with them to develop technologies that could control reality itself. The Montauk Project is basically the source code for Stranger Things, the secret laboratory, the kid with psychic powers, the portal to another dimension, the government conspiracy to hide the truth. It all comes from this elaborate mythology that grew out of Al Bielek's claims about suppressed memories. Bielek's claims about the Montauk Project were further developed and popularized by Preston Nichols, an engineer who claimed to have worked on the project and who co-authored a series of books about the alleged research. Starting with the Montauk Project experiments in time, in 1992, Nichols and his collaborators produced a series of increasingly elaborate accounts of secret government research into time travel, mind control, and interdimensional phenomena. The books claimed to be based on recovered memories and insider knowledge, but they read more like science fiction novels than factual accounts. The Montauk books were hugely popular in conspiracy theory circles and helped establish a detailed mythology around the alleged project. They described specific technologies, named particular researchers, and provided dates and locations for various experiments. They created a comprehensive alternative history in which the government had been secretly developing reality-altering technologies for decades. But like so many conspiracy theories, the Montauk Project claims were long on dramatic allegations and short on verifiable evidence. No documentation was ever produced to support the existence of the project. None of the named researchers could be independently verified. The technologies described in the books violated known laws of physics in ways that made the original Philadelphia experiment claims seem conservative by comparison. The phenomenon of recovered memories that Al Bielek claimed to have experienced is worth examining from a psychological perspective. because it helps explain how conspiracy theories can seem completely real and convincing to the people who believe them. During the 1980s and 1990s, there was considerable controversy in the psychology community about recovered memory therapy, a treatment approach that was supposed to help patients remember traumatic experiences that they had forgotten or suppressed. Some therapists believed that the mind could completely block out traumatic memories as a protective mechanism, and that these memories could later be recovered through hypnosis, visualization, or other techniques. The problem was that many of the recovered memories that emerged from these therapy sessions turned out to be false. Patients would remember elaborate scenarios of abuse, satanic rituals, or alien abductions that had never actually occurred. The memories felt completely real to the patients, but they were actually products of suggestion, imagination, and the therapeutic process itself. Modern neuroscience has shown that human memory is much more malleable and unreliable than we once believed. Memories can be influenced by suggestions modified by subsequent experiences, and even created entirely from scratch, under the right circumstances. The line between genuine memory and imagination is often much blurrier than we realize. This doesn't necessarily mean that Al-Bellic was deliberately lying about his experiences. He may have genuinely believed that his memories of the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk project were real. But the psychological research on false memories suggests that such beliefs can be sincere without being accurate. Regardless of their factual accuracy, the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk project stories have had a significant impact on popular culture. They have inspired countless books, movies, television shows, and video games that explore themes of secret government research, time travel, and hidden realities. The influence can be seen in everything from The X-Files to Stranger Things to countless science fiction novels that feature government conspiracies and exotic technologies. The basic narrative template, secret military research that goes wrong and creates ongoing cover-ups, has become a standard trope in conspiracy-themed entertainment. This cultural influence is interesting because it shows how conspiracy theories can become self-perpetuating. As fictional stories inspired by conspiracy theories become popular, they introduce the basic concepts to new audiences who might not have encountered the original claims. Some of these new audiences might then assume that the fictional stories are based on factual events, creating a feedback loop that keeps the conspiracy theories alive. The line between entertainment and belief becomes particularly blurry when real-world conspiracy theorists point to fictional depictions as evidence that their claims are true. Some Philadelphia experiment believers have argued that Hollywood movies and television shows about secret government research are actually deliberate disclosure efforts, ways for insiders to reveal the truth while maintaining plausible deniability. Understanding why the Philadelphia experiment story has such enduring appeal requires looking beyond the specific claims to the deeper psychological and cultural needs that conspiracy theories serve. At its core, the Philadelphia experiment offers something that many people desperately want: the promise that reality is more interesting and meaningful than it appears on the surface. The idea that the government has secretly developed technologies that could revolutionize human civilization is far more exciting than the mundane truth that most military research involves incremental improvements to existing weapons and equipment. The story also provides a sense of special knowledge and insider status. People who believe in the Philadelphia experiment can feel like they're part of an exclusive group that knows the real truth about history and science. This can be psychologically satisfying, especially for people who feel powerless or ignored in their daily lives. There's also an element of validation for people who distrust authority figures and institutions. The Philadelphia experiment story confirms their suspicions that the government lies to the public, that scientists are involved in dangerous cover-ups, and that official histories can't be trusted. It provides a framework for understanding why the world often seems unjust or inexplicable. Finally, the story offers hope that human beings are capable of achieving miraculous things, even if those achievements are being hidden from public view. The idea that invisibility and teleportation are possible gives people a sense that we live in a universe full of untapped potential and undiscovered wonders. The rise of the internet has given new life to Philadelphia experiment theories and created opportunities for the story to evolve in ways that would have been impossible in earlier decades. Online forums, social media, and video sharing platforms have allowed believers to connect with each other, share information, and develop increasingly elaborate versions of the basic story. Modern Philadelphia experiment websites feature detailed timelines, technical diagrams, and testimonials from people who claim to have inside knowledge of the project. Some sites present the story as established historical fact, while others acknowledge the controversial nature of the claims, but argue that the evidence is compelling enough to warrant serious consideration. The internet has also made it easier for new witnesses to come forward with their own versions of events. People claiming to be former military personnel, government scientists, or family members of experiment participants regularly post their stories online, adding new details and complications to the overall narrative. At the same time, the internet has made it easier for skeptics to access primary sources and conduct fact-checking research. Declassified military documents, ship logs, and personnel records are now available online, allowing independent researchers to verify or debunk specific claims about the Philadelphia experiment. This has created an interesting dynamic where both believers and skeptics have access to more information than ever before, but they often interpret the same evidence in completely different ways. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Philadelphia experiment story is how it has managed to survive and evolve across multiple generations. People who were born decades after the alleged experiment continue to find the story compelling and relevant to their own concerns about government secrecy and technological development. Each generation tends to update the story to reflect contemporary fears and interests. In the 1950s and 1960s, the focus was on Cold War anxieties about secret weapons development. In the 1980s and 1990s, mind control and psychological manipulation became central themes. In the internet age, the story has incorporated elements from quantum physics, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism. This generational evolution helps explain why conspiracy theories can persist long after their original context has disappeared. The specific details may change, but the underlying themes, distrust of authority, fascination with hidden knowledge, and hope for technological transcendence, remain constant across different time periods and cultural contexts. The Philadelphia experiment has also benefited from what scholars call cultural scaffolding, the way that fictional depictions and popular culture references help keep conspiracy theories alive in public consciousness. Movies, television shows, novels, and video games that reference the experiment introduce the basic concepts to new audiences and provide a shared cultural vocabulary for discussing the claims. Despite the lack of credible evidence for the Philadelphia experiment, serious researchers continue to investigate the claims using modern techniques and technologies. Some of these investigators are genuine skeptics trying to definitively debunk the story, while others are believers hoping to find the smoking gun evidence that will prove the experiment really happened. Modern investigations have taken advantage of Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain previously classified military documents from the World War II era. Researchers have conducted detailed analyses of Navy personnel records, ship movements, and experimental programs. They have interviewed surviving veterans and their families looking for any first-hand accounts of unusual experiences. The results of these investigations have been mixed. While no evidence has been found to support the dramatic claims about invisibility and teleportation, some researchers have uncovered evidence of legitimate classified research programs that might have provided the kernel of truth around which the Philadelphia experiment legend developed. For example, declassified documents show that the Navy was indeed conducting extensive research into electromagnetic countermeasures during World War II. Some of this research involved powerful electromagnetic fields that could have produced unusual visual effects or equipment malfunctions. It's possible that Carl Allen witnessed some kind of legitimate experiment and simply misunderstood what he was seeing. Despite decades of debunking efforts and the lack of credible evidence, the Philadelphia experiment continues to have passionate believers who are convinced that some version of the story is true. These modern believers have formed communities both online and offline, sharing research, comparing theories, and supporting each other's investigations. Contemporary Philadelphia experiment believers tend to be sophisticated in their approach to the evidence. They acknowledge that many early claims were exaggerated or fabricated, but they argue that this doesn't necessarily invalidate the core story. They focus on finding correlations between different accounts, identifying patterns in government responses, and looking for indirect evidence that might support their theories. Many modern believers have also expanded their focus beyond the original Philadelphia experiment to encompass a broader range of alleged secret government research programs. They see the 1943 experiment as just one piece of a much larger puzzle, involving decades of classified research into exotic technologies and consciousness manipulation. This broader perspective allows believers to maintain their convictions even when specific claims are debunked. If one piece of evidence turns out to be false, it can be dismissed as disinformation, while the overall theory remains intact. This makes the modern version of the Philadelphia experiment, conspiracy theory, much more resilient than earlier versions that depended on specific testimonies or documents. The persistence of Philadelphia experiment beliefs has also created a community of dedicated skeptics who work to counter misinformation and promote critical thinking about extraordinary claims. These skeptics include scientists, historians, and amateur researchers who volunteer their time to investigate conspiracy theories and educate the public about how to evaluate evidence. Modern skeptical investigations of the Philadelphia experiment have been remarkably thorough. Researchers have tracked down original source documents, interviewed key figures, and conducted detailed analyses of the physical and historical claims. They have created comprehensive databases of information about the USS Eldridge, the personnel involved, and the military context of the alleged experiment. Perhaps most importantly, skeptical researchers have tried to understand why the Philadelphia experiment story is so compelling and what legitimate scientific and historical questions it raises. Rather than simply dismissing believers as ignorant or delusional, many skeptics have engaged in respectful dialogue about the nature of evidence, the limits of official historical accounts, and the legitimate concerns about government secrecy that conspiracy theories often reflect. This approach has been more effective than simple debunking in reaching people who are genuinely curious about the Philadelphia experiment claims. By acknowledging the real issues that conspiracy theories address while explaining why specific claims are unsupported, skeptical researchers have been able to maintain constructive conversations with believers and interested observers. Regardless of whether the Philadelphia experiment actually happened, the story provides valuable lessons about how to evaluate extraordinary claims, understand the nature of evidence, and think critically about authority and expertise. The Philadelphia experiment case study demonstrates how conspiracy theories develop and evolve over time. It shows how initial misunderstandings or fabrications can grow into elaborate mythologies that take on lives of their own. It illustrates the importance of primary sources, contemporary documentation, and independent verification in historical research. The story also highlights the challenges of investigating claims about classified government activities. Even when official denials are sincere and accurate, they can seem suspicious to people who have legitimate reasons to distrust government institutions. The secrecy that surrounds much military research creates an environment where conspiracy theories can flourish, regardless of whether there's any truth to them. From a scientific perspective, the Philadelphia experiment provides an excellent case study in how to distinguish between what's theoretically possible and what's practically achievable. The story illustrates the importance of understanding the energy requirements, technological limitations, and physical constraints that govern what kinds of phenomena are possible in the real world. After 8 decades of investigation, debate, and speculation, Some questions about the Philadelphia experiment remain unanswered, not because the truth is being hidden, but because the available evidence is simply insufficient to provide definitive conclusions about every aspect of the story. We may never know exactly what Carl Allen saw or thought he saw in Philadelphia Harbor in 1943. We may never fully understand why he chose to fabricate or embellish his account in the letters to Morris Jessup. We may never be able to identify all of the classified military research programs that were conducted during World War II, or determine whether any of them might have provided the kernel of truth around which the Philadelphia experiment legend developed. These lingering uncertainties don't validate the dramatic claims about invisibility and teleportation, but they do remind us that historical truth can be complex and elusive. Official records can be incomplete or misleading. Witness testimony can be unreliable. Even well-intentioned investigators can reach incorrect conclusions based on limited or ambiguous evidence. The Philadelphia experiment story teaches us to maintain appropriate humility about what we can and can't know with certainty, while still insisting on rigorous standards of evidence for extraordinary claims. It reminds us that the absence of complete knowledge doesn't justify belief in impossible phenomena, but it also doesn't mean that all official accounts should be accepted without question. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Philadelphia experiment isn't what it tells us about naval research in 1943, but what it reveals about American culture in the decades that followed. The enduring popularity of the story reflects deep-seated anxieties about technology authority and the pace of social change that have shaped American society since World War II. The Philadelphia experiment emerged during the early Cold War period, when Americans were grappling with the implications of nuclear weapons, the reality of permanent military-industrial establishments, and the growing power of scientific experts. The story provided a way for people to express their concerns about these developments while maintaining hope that extraordinary achievements might be possible. Over the decades, the story has continued to evolve in response to changing cultural concerns. The mind control elements that became prominent in the 1980s reflected anxieties about psychological manipulation and loss of individual autonomy. The Internet age versions that incorporate quantum physics and consciousness research speak to contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence and transhumanism. In this sense, the Philadelphia experiment functions as a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting our collective hopes and fears about technology, government, and the future of human civilization. Whether or not the story is factually accurate, it serves important psychological and social functions that help explain its remarkable persistence and continued relevance. So, after all that, after 80 years of whispers, books, letters, and late-night radio shows, after diving deep into naval archives, physics textbooks, and the complicated psychology of belief, what are we left with? A ship that was probably enjoying some Caribbean sunshine in the Bahamas while it was supposedly teleporting around the East Coast. A misunderstood scientific process called degaussing that saved thousands of lives by protecting ships from magnetic mines. And one incredibly creative, possibly lonely merchant mariner named Carl Allen, who managed to spin a yarn so compelling that it's still captivating people 8 decades later. The shocking evidence dissolves under scrutiny like sugar in rain. The witnesses appear decades after the fact, often after movies and books have already planted the seeds of their memories. The science described in the allegations requires energy levels that dwarf anything we've ever achieved as a species. The official records, when they can be examined, tell a completely different and much more mundane story. And yet, the story won't die. It's too good. It's too perfectly constructed to satisfy our deepest desires for mystery and meaning. It's too terrifying in its implications and too hopeful in its possibilities. It offers secret knowledge, hidden truths, and the promise that reality is far stranger than the authorities want us to believe. The USS Eldridge herself lived a long and unremarkable life after World War II, serving in the Greek Navy as the Attis until 1992. She never teleported again, never bent space-time, never flickered between dimensions. She carried cargo, transported personnel, and performed the thousands of routine tasks that make up the actual day-to-day reality of naval service. When she was finally scrapped, there were no mysterious glows, no temporal anomalies, no evidence that she had ever been anything more than an ordinary destroyer escort, built during extraordinary time. But in the realm of legend and folklore, the Eldridge will live forever as the ship that conquered physics itself, however, briefly and disastrously. She's become a symbol of human ambition, unchecked by wisdom, of scientific hubris, meeting cosmic justice, of the thin line between breakthrough and catastrophe that defines so much of modern technological civilization. The real classified truth about the Philadelphia experiment might be this: it's not a story about physics or naval warfare or government conspiracy. It's a story about us. It's about our complicated relationship with authority, our fascination with the unknown, and our deep-seated hope that there's something more to existence than the mundane reality we experience every day. In our current age of information overload and institutional distrust, the Philadelphia experiment story feels more relevant than ever. We live in a time when official explanations are automatically suspect, when social media algorithms amplify the most sensational claims, and when the line between fact and fiction becomes blurrier every day. The story teaches us important lessons about how to navigate this landscape. It shows us why critical thinking skills are essential in an era of information abundance. It demonstrates the importance of primary sources, independent verification, and healthy skepticism about extraordinary claims. But it also reminds us that dismissing all alternative narratives as conspiracy theories can blind us to legitimate questions about power, secrecy, and accountability. Perhaps most importantly, the Philadelphia experiment reveals our profound need for wonder and mystery in an increasingly demystified world. The scientific method has given us incredible power to understand and manipulate our environment, but it has also stripped away many of the comforting illusions that made life seem meaningful and magical for previous generations. Stories like the Philadelphia experiment serve as a kind of cultural compensation for this loss. They restore a sense of mystery and possibility to a world that often feels over-explained and under-inspiring. They remind us that there might still be frontiers to explore, secrets to uncover, and wonders to discover. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that impulse. The desire to believe in something extraordinary is fundamentally human and fundamentally healthy. The problem only arises when we let that desire override our commitment to truth and evidence. The universe is already far stranger and more wonderful than most people realize. Quantum mechanics reveals a reality where particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously and influence each other instantaneously across vast distances. Cosmology shows us a universe filled with dark matter and dark energy that we barely understand. Neuroscience is uncovering the mysteries of consciousness and revealing how malleable our perception of reality really is. We don't need impossible stories about teleporting ships to find wonder in the world. Reality is already sufficiently amazing if we take the time to understand it properly. But that brings us to a more personal question. What do you think, after spending all this time together exploring this wonderfully weird piece of history, where do you find yourself landing? Are you more convinced than ever that the Philadelphia experiment is the greatest naval tall tale ever told? A perfect storm of wartime secrecy, misunderstood science, and one man's overactive imagination that somehow captured the collective unconscious of conspiracy-minded Americans. Or are you thinking that maybe there's a kernel of truth buried under 80 years of government denials and deliberate disinformation, that perhaps something unusual really did happen in Philadelphia Harbor in 1943, even if it wasn't quite as dramatic as the legend suggests? Both positions are understandable and both reflect deeper philosophical questions about knowledge, authority, and the nature of truth itself. In a world where governments have proven themselves capable of massive deceptions, where scientific experts sometimes get things wrong. And where official histories are written by the winners, a certain amount of skepticism is not just healthy, it's essential. The challenge is maintaining that skepticism without sliding into cynicism or gullibility. It's possible to question official narratives without automatically believing every alternative explanation. It's possible to demand evidence for extraordinary claims without dismissing the legitimate concerns that conspiracy theories often express. The Philadelphia experiment story in all its various incarnations represents both the best and worst of American skepticism. At its best, it reflects a healthy distrust of authority and a demand for transparency from public institutions. At its worst, it shows how the desire for simple explanations can lead us to embrace complex fantasies that are even less credible than the official stories we're trying to reject. What part of this whole saga blew your mind the most? Was it the elaborate mythology that grew up around Al Bielek's recovered memories? The fact that the Navy actually published an annotated version of Morris Jessup's UFO book? The possibility that Tesla's death and the alleged experiment were connected by more than just coincidence? Or maybe what struck you most was the human element, the tragedy of Morris Jessup, driven to despair by his association with a story that destroyed his scientific credibility. The lonely figure of Carl Allen, spinning elaborate tales that might have started as genuine confusion, but grew into something much more complex and troubling. As we wrap up our deep dive into this particular rabbit hole, it's worth thinking about what the future might hold for stories like the Philadelphia experiment. How will conspiracy theories evolve in an age of artificial intelligence, deepfake technology, and increasingly sophisticated information warfare? On one hand, these new technologies might make it easier than ever to create convincing fake evidence for extraordinary claims. Deepfake videos could show impossible events with photographic realism. AI-generated documents could provide seemingly authentic historical records for events that never happened. The line between reality and fabrication could become so blurred that traditional methods of fact-checking and verification become inadequate. On the other hand, the same technologies that enable sophisticated deception also provide new tools for detecting it. AI systems can identify deepfakes and generated text. Blockchain technology could provide tamper-proof records of authentic information. Crowdsourced fact-checking and collaborative investigation platforms could harness collective intelligence to separate truth from fiction more effectively than any individual researcher. The real question is whether our critical thinking skills and media literacy will evolve fast enough to keep pace with these technological changes. Will future generations be better equipped to navigate an information landscape filled with deliberately crafted deceptions? Or will they be more vulnerable than ever to believing whatever confirms their pre-existing beliefs? The Philadelphia experiment story offers some hope in this regard. Despite 8 decades of evolution and embellishment, the core claims have never been able to withstand serious scrutiny. The power of evidence-based reasoning, when properly applied, has proven remarkably effective at distinguishing between what's real and what's wishful thinking. But the story also offers a warning. Truth and falsehood don't compete on a level playing field. False but appealing stories often spread faster and wider than true but boring facts. Conspiracy theories that satisfy deep psychological needs can persist indefinitely, regardless of how thoroughly they've been debunked. The challenge for all of us, whether we're researchers, educators, content creators, or just curious individuals trying to understand the world, is to find ways to make truth as compelling as fiction, to tell accurate stories that are as engaging as made-up ones, to satisfy people's need for wonder and mystery without abandoning our commitment to evidence and reason. Alright everyone, that's our deep dive for tonight. Thanks for hanging out with me and exploring this wonderfully weird piece of history. I hope it was boring enough to help you drift off to sleep, but interesting enough to fuel some strange dreams about ships that slip between dimensions and sailors who walk through walls. More than anything, I hope this journey has reminded you that the world is full of genuine mysteries that don't require impossible explanations. The story of how a lonely merchant mariner's letters transformed into a decade-spanning mythology is in its own way more fascinating than any tale of teleporting destroyers. The psychology of belief, the sociology of conspiracy theories, and the cultural functions of modern folklore are all rich areas for exploration that don't require us to abandon our commitment to evidence and reason. The next time you encounter an extraordinary claim, whether it's about secret government experiments, miraculous medical cures, or revolutionary new technologies, remember the Philadelphia experiment. Ask yourself what kind of evidence would be needed to support such a claim. Are there simpler explanations that haven't been properly considered? What psychological or cultural needs might the story be serving, regardless of whether it's factually accurate? And remember that it's okay to say, I don't know. One of the most important lessons we can learn from the Philadelphia experiment is that uncertainty is a natural and healthy state of mind. We don't need to have definitive answers to every question. We don't need to choose between believing everything and believing nothing. The universe is vast, complex, and full of phenomena that we don't yet understand. There are almost certainly secrets in government archives, breakthrough technologies in development, and discoveries waiting to be made that will revolutionize our understanding of reality. But the way to uncover these genuine mysteries is through careful investigation, rigorous methodology, and respect for evidence, not through wishful thinking and conspiracy theories. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay humble about the limits of human knowledge. Question authority, but don't automatically assume that the most dramatic alternative explanation is the correct one. Demand transparency from public institutions, but remember that the absence of information isn't evidence of conspiracy. And most importantly, don't let your fascination with the unknown turn into cynicism about the known. The real world, the world of quantum mechanics and cosmology, of evolutionary biology and neuroscience, of history and archaeology and all the other fields where humans have worked to understand reality, is already strange and wonderful enough to satisfy anyone's appetite for mystery. Got any ideas for other historical rabbit holes we should fall down together? Drop them in the comments below. I read all of them, especially the really out there theories that make me question everything I thought I knew about the world. Until next time, sleep well, dream of impossible ships and the brave sailors who rowed them into the unknown. And remember that sometimes the most beautiful truth is that we live in a universe where such dreams are possible, even if they're not always real.